I want you to think of that word punishment. We live in a very soft age. We don't mind killing people by the million, atom bombs or war. But apart from that, we're a very soft age. And in the Christian church, even many Christian leaders do not like talking about the wrath of God, the chastisement placed upon Christ, that Christ was made a curse for us, that he was wounded by God for our transgressions. Many Christian leaders don't like that. In one of the places where I was 2 weeks ago, many wonderful people, but certain of the religious leaders in that city for decades had led the thousands of believers in their church to conclude the cross was not necessary. It was only just a gesture of love, but that it was not an atonement. It was not a sacrifice. This is known as the subjective view of the atonement. I've told you a little about it before, I think. It was spawned by a man called Peter Abelard, very intelligent man, but regarded as very arrogant. And he was teaching a beautiful niece and fathered a child through her. The niece's father was very angry and sent soldiers to castrate Peter. He went on to criticise other doctrines of the Christian faith. But it wasn't until the 19th century that a very prominent man in the Western world took it up by the name of Horace Bushnell. And he began to teach the same thing of this man centuries before. But Bushnell, before he died, recanted and wrote a book called Forgiveness and Law, in which he said, I plead with my ministering brethren to preach about the propitiatory sufferings of our Redeemer, because to preach as I have preached in the past, that his death was not necessary and it was only a gesture, it has no power. But I tell you that while I was preaching in this city, the followers of those who taught for decades that the cross was not a sacrifice organised their meeting to bring people away from my meeting. And so we had two great companies going. Now, I have to say this to you. I know the key men concerned, and I don't expect to see them in the kingdom because they'll be too near the throne. God doesn't judge us by how accurate our theology is, or none of us would make it. God judges us by whether we love Jesus and whether we love our fellow men, because you don't need much theology for that. So I do want to insist that the men who in this city have led away thousands of people, particularly doctors and dentists, for generations, from the gospel teaching that Christ was a sacrifice to God, which is taught so clearly in Ephesians 5:2, he offered himself for us as a fragrant sacrifice to God. Hebrews 9:14, he offered himself without spot as a sacrifice to God. Once at the end of the age has he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. By one offering he has forever sanctified, and so on and so on and so on. But the men responsible, who inherited it from worldly universities, are good men. Good theology does not necessarily make a good man. It should help, but it doesn't always. And bad theology doesn't necessarily make a bad man. The men to whom I refer are good men, and I repeat, they'll be so near the throne of the kingdom I won't see them. It's very important to remember a lot of things. Error never sanctifies, error is never harmless, but the main error is not to love. That's the main error. And none of us know much. You know, Spurgeon said all we know can go in a thimble and the girl's finger as well. That is true. That is true. Paul says if any one of us think we know anything, we don't know anything yet, such as we ought to know. If any one of us, I've been to 3 universities, I've been reading the Bible now for nearly 70 years. But if any one of us thinks we know anything, we know nothing yet as we ought to know. But anyway, I'm drawing your attention to this verse which says the chastisement, punishment. He was pierced, he was bruised. It pleased the Lord to bruise him. The Bible does teach that Christ was a sacrifice for sins, that he took the penalty that was ours, that we might have the righteousness that was his. The Bible is very emphatic that our Saviour did truly suffer, and it was not just a display. When he entered Gethsemane, he suddenly began to shake all over, and it was as though he'd seen a terrible apparition that seared his nerves and made his blood cold. And he said, I'm feeling near unto death. And in Gethsemane, which means the place of the olive press, if the pressure he'd been under had turned half a screw more, he'd have died in Gethsemane. His main sufferings were not physical. Now, I detest physical pain, whether it's an earache or a splinter, trifles. I can't concentrate. I want to read a book and I've got this miserable splinter and I can't get it out. Or I've got to go to the dentist, and I don't like dentists, though they're very valuable people. I often confess I would swim through a sewer to avoid pain. But Christ's pain was not primarily physical. He suffered the second death. The second death is when the wicked realise they have lost God forever. That's when there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's when people will go out in madness by the million. That is the second death, when people realise they have lost God forever. Never forget, to be born only once means to die twice. That's why Jesus said you must be born again. To be born twice means you'll die only once, or perhaps not at all. Depends when Jesus comes. See? But the main point I'm making is Christ did suffer. This passage says over and over and over that God treated him as though he was sin incarnate. That's why Christ, in tears, cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's why the sun was blackened for 3 hours. It represented his heart and mind. Hope did not present to him his coming forth from the grave a conqueror, though he'd predicted it. But on the cross he became sin itself. 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him to be sin for us. Never forget it. Galatians 3:13, he was made a curse for us. So important. His main pain on the cross was the severing between himself and his Father. People say, oh, he made a mistake. God didn't really forsake him. Are we saying that Jesus was wrong? Are we saying that God on the cross erred? Of course not. The blotting out of the sun was the symbol that Christ had become innate wickedness, darkness, a curse, sin itself for us.